April 29, 1945. The moment American forces arrived at Dachau concentration camp, they were not just liberating the living, they were about to face a terrifying truth about the end of the Nazi guards. What happened next sent shockwaves through the military as U.S. soldiers became judge, jury, and executioner. The guards who had terrorized the camp for over a decade were about to meet a bloody fate, but why did it happen, and who was responsible for this brutal wave of revenge? April 29, 1945, the 42nd Infantry Division, part of the U.S. Army's 7th Army, approached the gates of Dachau, a concentration camp that had stood as a symbol of Nazi terror for over 12 years. As they neared the camp, an unbearable stench filled the air, an acrid mix of decaying flesh, human waste, and the distinct smell of burning corpses. The soldiers, many of them still young, had fought their way across Europe, witnessing destruction and death at every turn, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited them inside the gates of Dachau. The first horrifying sight was a train of cattle cars, sitting idly on a nearby siding just outside the camp. The boxcars, which had been used to transport thousands of prisoners, now contained the lifeless bodies of over 2,000 men, women, and children. These prisoners had been crammed into the cars during the last desperate months of the Nazi regime, forced to endure a journey from hell, deprived of food, water, and sanitation. Many had died on the journey. Others had perished just before they arrived at Dachau. Some bodies were still warm when the train opened. For the soldiers, this was just the beginning. Private First Class John Lee, part of the 42nd Infantry, later described the scene as something that defied human comprehension. The sight of the stacked bodies, the victims of starvation and disease, was so shocking that several soldiers had to cover their faces with gas masks or handkerchiefs just to endure the overwhelming stench. But the soldiers pushed forward, driven by the duty to liberate the prisoners, and yet they could not fully process what they were about to witness inside the camp. As the soldiers moved further into the camp, the gravity of what they had uncovered became more apparent. Everywhere they looked, there were signs of cruelty and death. The living prisoners, barely alive, stumbled toward them. Their skeletal bodies were so emaciated that many soldiers initially mistook them for the dead. The survivors were a heartbreaking sight, eyes sunken deep into their skulls, skin hanging loose over bones. Their frailty was a testament to the systematic brutality they had endured for years. But it wasn't just the living that left the soldiers speechless. It was the organization of the camp itself. The barracks, where prisoners had once slept in overcrowded conditions, were filled with piles of personal belongings, shoes, eyeglasses, clothing, discarded like trash. Everything in the camp told a story of systematic dehumanization, of men and women reduced to mere numbers, stripped of their identities, their dignity, and their very lives. But even as the soldiers began to grasp the full scope of Dachau's horrors, what they would discover next would drive them to take matters into their own hands, setting off a deadly chain of events that would turn liberators into executioners. As the soldiers of the 42nd Infantry Division moved deeper into Dachau, they were confronted with the scale of death that seemed to stretch beyond anything they had imagined. The camp was not just a place of suffering, it was a well-oiled machine of terror, systematically built to eradicate the lives of those imprisoned within its walls. But what they encountered next, as they moved past the gates, would mark them forever. One of the first areas the soldiers investigated was a large open space near the camp's railway tracks, where the horrors of Dachau were laid bare. The smell of decaying flesh was overpowering, but it was the sight of what lay ahead that shook even the battle-hardened soldiers to their core. Just outside the camp, a train had arrived from another camp, carrying the bodies of over 2,000 prisoners. These prisoners, who had been packed into cattle cars under unimaginable conditions, had been transported as part of the Nazis' desperate attempt to conceal their atrocities. Many had died during the journey from exhaustion, hunger, or disease, while others had perished just before the train reached Dachau.
the cattle cars were opened, revealing the horrific truth of what the prisoners had endured. The bodies were stacked like firewood, too many to count. Some of the corpses still had the warmth of life in them, a grim reminder of the suffering that had taken place just before liberation. Private First Class John Lee later recalled the gut-wrenching sight, saying that the soldiers had to use gas masks and handkerchiefs to shield themselves from the unbearable stench that hit them upon opening the train cars. The bodies were so tightly packed together that there was no space left between them, making it impossible to distinguish one from another. The smell of decay and death was overwhelming, and some soldiers became physically ill from the sight and the stench. But it was not just the bodies of adults that horrified the soldiers. It was the sight of children among the dead. The bodies of young children, their limbs twisted and contorted in unnatural positions, were scattered among the adult corpses. For many of the soldiers, this was the most painful sight of all. Many of them had siblings back home, and the thought of innocent children suffering such a cruel fate was almost too much to bear. The soldiers were forced to look away, unable to process what they had just seen. As they moved away from the train cars, the soldiers continued their grim investigation of the camp. They found more evidence of the Nazis' systematic cruelty, piles of discarded personal belongings, shoes and eyeglasses that had once belonged to victims, now tossed aside like refuse. The scale of the camp's operation was shocking. The brutality was not random or accidental. It was methodical, a carefully planned program of death that had been carried out for years. The very architecture of the camp itself seemed designed to facilitate the mass murder of the prisoners, as if the Nazis had perfected their methods over time to ensure efficiency in their horrors. But the discovery of the bodies was just the beginning. The true extent of Dachau's horrors would only become clear once the soldiers ventured deeper into the camp, and what they found next would be beyond anything they had ever imagined. As the soldiers moved deeper into Dachau, the full weight of the horrors they had uncovered began to settle in. The bodies of the dead were just the beginning. The true terror lay in the survivors, the emaciated prisoners who had somehow managed to cling to life amidst unimaginable suffering. These survivors, so fragile that many appeared to be nothing more than walking skeletons, now stood before the American soldiers, their faces blank with shock, their eyes hollow from years of deprivation.
The first thing the soldiers noticed was how skeletal the survivors were. These men and women who had once been healthy and strong had been reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. Many of the living prisoners were so gaunt that the soldiers initially mistook them for the dead. Their ribs jutted out from under loose, sagging skin, and the faces were so hollowed out that their eyes seemed to sink deep into their skulls. Private First Class John Lee, who had seen his fair share of death and destruction, later recalled that the sight was almost unbearable. They looked like ghosts, he said. Some of them couldn't even move. They were so weak. It was like they had been reduced to nothing but skin and bones. The prisoners were so weak that they could barely stand, let alone speak. The soldiers had to help them walk, guiding them out of the barracks where they had been confined for so long. The barracks themselves were just as shocking as the prisoners within them. The soldiers found rooms packed with so many people that the survivors had to sleep in shifts, often with 3 or 4 people sharing a single bunk. The stench of unwashed bodies mixed with the lingering smell of death, making it difficult for the soldiers to stay in the rooms for long. Many prisoners were too weak to speak or even comprehend what was happening around them. They simply stared blankly at the soldiers, unable to process the fact that they were finally free. But amidst the devastation, there were moments of clarity. Some survivors, despite their extreme weakness, managed to find their voices. They pointed to specific guards who had tormented them, identifying the men who had carried out the most brutal acts. The liberated prisoners, even in their frail state, still carried vivid memories of their tormentors. These memories would play a critical role in the soldiers' understanding of the crimes that had taken place at Dachau and would fuel the rage that was quickly building among the American troops. One of the most gut-wrenching sights was the discovery of the medical experiments that had been carried out on the prisoners. The soldiers found the remnants of what could only be described as Nazi pseudoscience, rooms filled with medical equipment designed for experiments that no human being should have ever had to endure. Some prisoners had been subjected to freezing experiments, while others had been tested in high-altitude conditions. The survivors told horrifying tales of how they had been forced to endure these torturous procedures in the name of Nazi science. The soldiers, many of whom were just teenagers, could barely comprehend the extent of the cruelty that had been inflicted on these people. It was during this moment, amidst the wreckage of the book-and-walled prison barracks, that the true face of the camp's tormentors emerged. And what happened next would set in motion a brutal wave of violence that no one could have anticipated. As the soldiers ventured further into the depths of Dachau, they encountered the camp's chilling heart, the crematorium. The discovery of the oven, still warm from recent use, left the soldiers frozen in disbelief. This wasn't just a place of death, it was a factory of murder, designed with efficiency in mind, capable of disposing of countless bodies every day. The smell of charred flesh still lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the countless lives that had been extinguished within the walls of this grim structure. For the American soldiers, the sight of the crematorium's ovens was a final shocking confirmation of the horrors they had only begun to understand. The walls around the crematorium were lined with piles of bodies, some partially burned, others awaiting their turn to be incinerated. The corpses were stacked with chilling precision, their faces frozen in expressions of pain and fear. The soldiers couldn't look away, even as the weight of what they had uncovered began to settle in. The sheer scale of the camp's operations was overwhelming. This wasn't the work of a few rogue individuals. This was a systematic program of murder on industrial scale. The Nazis had designed every part of Dachau, from the gas chambers to the ovens, with the sole purpose of exterminating human life as efficiently as possible. What struck the soldiers most was the cold, mechanical nature of the process. The bodies were reduced to nothing more than waste, burned and discarded like trash. The prisoners who had been forced to work the crematorium had been reduced to little more than cogs in a horrifying machine of death. Many of the American soldiers later remarked that they felt as though they were witnessing the very essence of human cruelty, an organized, methodical attempt to destroy entire lives without regard for the dignity of those involved.
Yet, as disturbing as the crematorium was, it was not the most chilling discovery. The soldiers also found the remnants of the camp's medical experimentation rooms, where the Nazis had carried out twisted and inhumane procedures on the prisoners in the name of science. Medical equipment, left behind in a hurry, still stood in these rooms, bearing silent witness to the atrocities committed. The records of the experiments were incomplete, but the evidence of their brutality was clear. Freezing experiments that left prisoners with frostbite so severe that their limbs had to be amputated. High-altitude tests that killed many before they could even survive, and countless other horrors. The survivors of these experiments were the lucky ones, those who had somehow escaped death or been left behind as the Nazis fled. For the American soldiers, these discoveries were a final, unspoken proof of the depths of Nazi depravity. But what came next, as the soldiers began to process what they had discovered, would push them beyond their breaking point and spark a violent wave of revenge that no one could stop. The sight of the medical experimentation rooms sent a wave of cold shock through the soldiers, unlike anything they had experienced before. The rooms, designed to look like ordinary medical facilities, held a sinister secret. Inside, the remnants of what could only be described as grotesque Nazi pseudoscience were scattered across every surface. The soldiers, many of them just young men, struggled to process the unimaginable cruelty that had been carried out within these walls. On the tables and counters, they found pieces of medical equipment, devices meant for freezing experiments, high-altitude testing, and other horrific procedures that had been performed on the prisoners. It was clear that the Nazis had been testing the limits of human endurance, subjecting people to experiments that no one, let alone the most resilient, could survive. The survivors, barely alive and unable to articulate their pain, could only look at the Americans with haunted eyes, silently begging for their tormentors to be brought to justice. The most disturbing of all were the remnants of the freezing experiments. The Nazis had subjected prisoners to extreme cold, often for hours at a time, in order to test the limits of human survival. Some prisoners had their limbs frozen to the point of necrosis, only to be forced to endure even worse pain when the frozen areas were treated with hot water in a twisted attempt to revive them. The medical records found in the camp were incomplete, but the soldiers didn't need the details to understand the scope of the horror. The physical evidence alone was enough to make their blood run cold. There were also records of high-altitude experiments, where prisoners were subjected to low-pressure chambers meant to simulate the conditions at extreme altitudes. The Nazis had hoped to understand how humans would react to low oxygen levels, but the experiments had only one outcome: death. Soldiers later described how the survivors of these experiments appeared to be little more than shells of people, their bodies ravaged by the inhumane procedures. The psychological toll on the American soldiers was staggering. These were young men, barely out of their teens, who had fought through battles across Europe, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of what they were seeing. As they continued to search the camp, they found other evidence of the Nazis' twisted medical practices. There were surgical tools covered in dried blood, used to perform gruesome experiments on prisoners. The soldiers also uncovered documents detailing the names of those who had been subjected to these experiments, their final fates often sealed with a chilling indifference. The prisoners had been treated as nothing more than lab rats, their lives reduced to data points for an evil experiment. For the soldiers, the cruelty was unfathomable. How could anyone, let alone people who claimed to be doctors, subject another human being to such horrific treatment? The medical experimentation rooms were not just rooms filled with tools and records. They were a direct reflection of the Nazi philosophy. They believed that some lives were disposable, unworthy of compassion or dignity. The American soldiers who had fought so hard to liberate Europe from tyranny now found themselves staring at the darkest corners of humanity, struggling to comprehend what had been done here in the name of science. The psychological toll of what they were witnessing began to set in, and it would have lasting consequences on many of the soldiers involved.
But even as the soldiers grappled with the reality of the horrors in the medical rooms, they could feel the anger building inside them, a fury that would soon erupt, turning liberators into executioners. As the American soldiers continued their work in Dachau, a shift began to occur. The initial shock of liberation had faded, replaced by a growing sense of anger and helplessness. The soldiers had seen battle. They had witnessed death. But nothing had prepared them for the sight of the concentration camp and the suffering within it. As they walked among the skeletal survivors and uncovered the grisly evidence of medical experiments, their hardened composure began to crack. They had entered Dachau as liberators, but the horrors they found inside twisted them in ways that none of them had anticipated. Many of the soldiers had already been to hell and back on the front lines of Europe. But Dachau was different. This wasn't just war, it was systematic, industrialized cruelty. The emotional toll began to weigh heavily on the young soldiers, who, having faced enemy soldiers, now faced the brutal aftermath of Nazi atrocities. The scale of human suffering was unlike anything they had witnessed. It wasn't just the bodies or the conditions. It was the knowledge that this had been planned, that human beings had been reduced to mere objects for a cruel experiment. Some soldiers, particularly those who had been in the fight for months, struggled to hold their composure. They had been trained for war, trained to fight for freedom, but nothing in their training had prepared them for the moral collapse they felt walking through Dachau's gates. The mental and emotional strain began to show. Some soldiers wept openly, unable to process the overwhelming horror.
Others, in their shock, could not bring themselves to speak. They simply walked, numb, through the camp, taking in the sights and sounds that would haunt them forever. The psychological toll went beyond what they had seen. It was the realization that this evil was so deeply ingrained, so carefully orchestrated, that it had become part of the Nazi machinery. The survivors, too, were affected by this realization. Many had not spoken in years, their minds shattered by the brutal treatment they had endured. For some, seeing their tormentors finally captured was almost too much to bear. They had spent so long suffering that even their liberation seemed surreal. But perhaps the most profound impact was the anger that began to build in the soldiers. The level of cruelty they had witnessed left many with a burning desire for revenge. The stories they heard from the survivors of beatings, executions, and daily horrors fueled the soldiers' emotions. They had come to liberate, to save the innocent, but what they found in Dachau left them questioning everything. It wasn't just a matter of justice, it was personal. The soldiers had seen their fellow men reduced to nothing, and now, standing in the midst of the devastation, they were consumed with a desire to make those responsible pay.
The transformation was immediate. The soldiers who had maintained their discipline through months of battle were now becoming something different: avengers. What had begun as a mission of liberation was rapidly turning into a mission of retribution. The desire for justice, however flawed and raw, became overwhelming. As the soldiers gathered in groups, speaking of what they had seen, the consensus was clear. These men, the Nazi guards, had to pay. But as the soldiers began to identify the guards responsible for these crimes, something darker began to unfold, a wave of violence that would spread like wildfire through the camp. The rage that had been simmering inside the soldiers for hours began to boil over. As the full scale of the atrocities became clear, the American troops, once disciplined, professional soldiers, were overtaken by a primal desire for vengeance. The horror of what they had uncovered was too much to process through the legal systems they had been trained to respect. The first spark of violence ignited in the camp's coal yard, a place where the soldiers had gathered the SS guards who had been left behind. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, who had entered Dachau with his men, could see the transformation taking place among the troops. Soldiers who had been steadfast in battle were now consumed by a raw, unfiltered anger. In the coal yard, 17 SS guards had been rounded up and were being held under the watch of the American forces. These were the men who had been responsible for the systematic destruction of innocent lives, those who had overseen the gas chambers, the crematorium, the medical experiments, and the torture. The guards, some of whom had tried to flee, were now fully aware that their fate was sealed. The soldiers, some of them barely out of their teens, had identified these men as the architects of unspeakable suffering. They had seen the bodies, the survivors, the remnants of brutality on an industrial scale, and they wanted justice. But in the heat of the moment, the soldiers were no longer thinking about trials or formalities. They were thinking about retribution. Without warning and without orders from their commanding officers, American soldiers opened fire on the 17 guards in the coal yard. The scene was chaotic, brutal, and swift. The men, their hands raised in surrender, were shot down in an instant, their bodies crumpling to the ground. The soldiers fired with cold precision, ensuring that none of the guards would survive. The sound of gunfire echoed through the camp, mingling with the screams of dying men. The ground beneath them darkened as the blood of the guards mixed with the coal dust that covered the yard. Private James Thompson, a soldier who had participated in the execution, later described the event with chilling clarity. He had seen the faces of the guards, the same faces that had haunted the prisoners for years. In that moment, all the training and discipline seemed to fall away, replaced by a desire for revenge. We didn't need orders. It wasn't about following orders anymore. It was about making sure these men didn't walk away from what they'd done. The execution in the coal yard set a precedent. The soldiers, now caught in the grip of their emotions, were no longer able to maintain the professional distance that they had once valued.
They had entered Dachau with a mission to liberate, but what they had found had transformed their mission into something else entirely, a hunt for those responsible for the horrors. The coal yard killings would be just the beginning of a violent wave that would spread throughout the camp, fueled by the desire for immediate justice. But the killings didn't stop there. As word of the execution spread through the camp, more guards were rounded up, and what followed was nothing short of chaos, a wave of violence that would blur the line between justice and revenge. What had started as a singular act of vengeance in the coal yard quickly escalated into a full-scale frenzy. As more SS guards were discovered throughout the camp, soldiers who had once driven by duty now found themselves consumed by a fierce and uncontrollable anger. The emotions that had been building ever since they first laid eyes on the horrors at Dachau, bodies stocked like firewood, emaciated survivors, the cold machinery of death had reached a boiling point. The soldiers had seen the proof of unimaginable cruelty, and now they sought immediate retribution. It wasn't just the 17 men executed in the coal yard anymore. As American forces advanced deeper into the camp, more guards, many of whom had been hiding or attempting to flee, were rounded up. Some tried to disguise themselves, shedding their uniforms and attempting to blend in with the civilian population or the liberated prisoners. But it was too late. The prisoners, still alive and now empowered by the liberation, had already identified their tormentors. Every guard, every officer was immediately marked, and the soldiers, their faces drawn with shock and rage, knew exactly who they were. The violence spread like wildfire. Soldiers who had once followed orders with military precision now acted on their emotions. In some parts of the camp, guards were shot outright, while in others they were beaten to death with whatever weapons the soldiers had on hand. Some were struck with rifle butts, others with shovels or metal bars. It was a brutal, indiscriminate display of violence, and as the executions unfolded, it became clear that the soldiers no longer viewed the guards as human beings, but as symbols of the evil they had just witnessed. At the crematorium, the scene was equally chaotic. Guards who had been found near the ovens, still warm with the bodies of the dead, were taken by the soldiers and without hesitation executed on the spot. Some guards, recognizing their fate, attempted to beg for their lives, offering information about hidden documents or valuables in exchange for mercy. Others, knowing the grim reality of what awaited them, tried to flee, but were quickly captured by American patrols or handed over by local German civilians eager to rid themselves of any association with the Nazi regime.
The soldiers' actions were swift and uncoordinated, driven by a collective sense of rage. There was no formal procedure for what was happening. It was not military justice, but raw vengeance. As the day wore on, more guards were executed, and the violence became increasingly unrestrained. The soldiers, many of whom had fought in brutal battles across Europe, were now waging their own war of retribution, one that did not follow the laws of warfare, but the laws of emotion. What started with small groups of guards in isolated areas of the camp soon spread throughout Dachau. Prisoners, weak and frail though many of them were, eagerly assisted in identifying their tormentors. Some guards were handed over to the very prisoners they had abused for years, and the justice they received was swift and brutal. In these moments, the prisoners who had been stripped of everything, dignity, safety, and their very lives, now took what little power they had left. The guards who had once wielded unimaginable power over them were now at their mercy. For the soldiers, the killing continued unabated. As more guards were executed, there were no protests from higher-ranking officers. In fact, many officers, too, had witnessed the horrors of Dachau and had no desire to stop the executions. While some commanders attempted to maintain order, the overwhelming sense of justice that had gripped the soldiers was too powerful to control. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, one of the first officers to enter the camp, later admitted that while he had not explicitly ordered the executions, he understood the rage behind them. He, too, had seen the horrors firsthand, and like many others, he struggled to reconcile the need for discipline with the overwhelming drive for revenge. As the executions continued, the soldiers' moral compasses began to erode completely, and what had started as a mission to liberate
had turned into something far more dangerous, a wild storm of violence that would leave deep scars on everyone involved. By the time the executions had reached their peak, it was clear that the American military leadership had lost control of the situation. What had begun as a mission of liberation had spiraled into a chaotic wave of revenge, with soldiers acting on raw emotion, driven by the unimaginable horrors they had uncovered at Dachau. The violent retribution against the SS guards had spread throughout the camp, and now the U.S. Army had to confront the question: what was the military's responsibility in this? As reports of the killings reached higher levels of command, the U.S. Army was forced to address the situation. An investigation was launched, led by Colonel Joseph Whitaker, who was assigned to examine the conduct of American forces during the liberation of concentration camps. The inquiry was both swift and thorough, but it was also controversial, as it had to deal with the undeniable fact that American soldiers had killed prisoners who had surrendered. For some, the question wasn't whether justice had been served, but whether American soldiers, who had been pushed to their emotional limits, had crossed a moral line. The soldiers involved in the killings didn't express much remorse for their actions. Many felt justified in what they had done. They had witnessed the unimaginable suffering of the prisoners, seen the medical experiments, and uncovered the bodies of the dead, thousands upon thousands of innocent victims. For them, the guards' death seemed a small price to pay for the horrors that had been inflicted on the people of Dachau. They had fought a brutal war for freedom, only to find that the very freedom they sought had been denied to the people they now liberated. Their fury felt like a natural response to the atrocities they had discovered. However, the military brass faced the dilemma. While they understood the soldiers' rage, they could not condone the breakdown of military discipline and the lack of a formal justice process. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was personally briefed on the situation and ordered the investigation. Eisenhower was a man known for his pragmatic leadership. He was deeply concerned about the precedent that these summary executions could set. The military's commitment to due process and the rule of law was one of the foundations upon which the Allies had based their victory. The fact that American soldiers had violated those very principles was troubling. Yet, the soldiers' actions were also seen through a more complex lens. Many higher-ups were sympathetic to the emotional and psychological toll the soldiers had endured. These were men who had faced the horrors of war for years, only to find a level of cruelty that seemed beyond the capacity of the human mind. The nature of what had been discovered at Dachau, torture, medical experiments, mass murder, was so overwhelming that the soldiers had found it impossible to follow the conventional rules of warfare. The question now was not just about justice, but about the human cost of dealing with such overwhelming evil. Colonel Whitaker's investigation ultimately revealed that the killings had been more extensive than initially reported. Estimates suggested that between 35 and over 100 guards had been killed during the liberation. Witness accounts from soldiers who had participated or witnessed the killings consistently justified the actions as a necessary response to the atrocities they had witnessed. The soldiers spoke about how they had witnessed the conditions in the camp, how they had seen the bodies of the dead, and how the brutality of the Nazi regime had scarred them beyond repair. For many, the line between justice and revenge had become increasingly blurred.
In the wake of the investigation, the U.S. Army faced a moral and legal crisis. Should they hold the soldiers accountable for actions that many believed were justified given the circumstances? Or should they consider the emotional trauma the soldiers had faced and allow the events to pass without further prosecution? The decision was made to handle the matter quietly, with no formal charges brought against the soldiers involved. Several officers received administrative reprimands, but no one was prosecuted. This decision was not without its critics. Some argued that prosecuting American soldiers for killing Nazi war criminals would send the wrong message, especially at a time when the world was still processing the horrors of the Holocaust. Others believed that the actions of the soldiers, though understandable, had undermined the very principles they had fought for. In the end, the decision to avoid legal consequences was primarily driven by the political and moral realities of the post-war world. It was a decision made to protect morale, to maintain unity, and to avoid further controversy as the world began to heal from the devastation of the war. But the aftermath of these events would not be so easily forgotten. The emotional scars on the soldiers, as well as the moral questions left unanswered, would continue to haunt the U.S. Army and the survivors of Dachau for years to come. As the dust settled on the events at Dachau, the soldiers who had participated in the executions were left with a heavy burden. The immediate aftermath of the killings was chaotic, and the emotions that had driven them, anger, disgust, and a thirst for justice, began to give way to a complex mix of guilt, confusion, and trauma. The soldiers who had acted in what they believed to be in retribution now found themselves questioning the morality of their actions. What had started as an instinctive response to unimaginable suffering had turned into a moral quandary that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. For many, the realization that they had crossed a line was difficult to accept. They had come to Dachau to liberate, to free the oppressed, but they had ended up becoming the very thing they had fought against: executioners without trial. The psychological toll was profound. Many of the soldiers, who had been trained to follow orders and maintain discipline, now found themselves struggling with the consequences of their actions. They had witnessed the worst of humanity and had acted in the heat of the moment, but the cost of those actions weighed heavily on them. The psychological impact of the killings was not confined to the soldiers. The survivors of Dachau, who had witnessed their tormentors' brutal end, were left with mixed feelings of satisfaction and unease. Some felt a deep sense of justice, believing that the guards had finally received the punishment they deserved. For others, however, the violent deaths of the guards brought with them an unsettling realization. The cycle of cruelty and vengeance had not been broken. Instead, it had continued, perpetuated by both the Nazis and the soldiers who had come to liberate them. The moral ambiguity of the killings would not be fully addressed at the time. The soldiers who had been involved in the violence often found themselves at odds with their own emotions. On one hand, they knew that the guards had committed unspeakable crimes, and they felt justified in exacting immediate punishment. On the other hand, they struggled to reconcile their actions with the values they had been trained to uphold, values that emphasize due process, law, and order. The soldiers were caught in a moral conflict that would haunt them for years to come. In the years that followed, many of the soldiers who had participated in the Dachau executions would seek help to cope with the trauma they had experienced. Some would go on to form tight-knit bonds with their fellow veterans, meeting annually to discuss their shared experience and support one another through the emotional aftermath. The memories of Dachau, of the horrors they had witnessed, and the decisions they had made would stay with them, shaping the rest of their lives. Some soldiers found peace with their actions, while others were consumed by guilt and regret. The burden of having crossed a line, of having become part of the very brutality they had fought against, was not an easy one to carry. For the survivors of Dachau, the legacy of that fateful day would be a complicated one. The desire for justice and vengeance had been fulfilled, but at a great moral cost. Many survivors, though they understood the rage that had led to the killings, wrestled with the idea that the cycle of violence had not been broken. They had suffered for so long under Nazi brutality that seeing their tormentors die gave them a sense of closure. But for some, the brutality of the American soldiers left a bitter taste in their mouths. The survivors had endured cruelty at the hands of the Nazis, but now they were forced to reckon with the reality that their liberators had also crossed a line. The events at Dachau, the executions of the Nazi guards, and the emotional and moral fallout would resonate long after the war had ended. The American soldiers who had participated in the killings would carry the weight of their actions for the rest of their lives, haunted by the memory of the brutal retribution they had exacted. And for the survivors of Dachau, the liberation they had longed for came at a great cost. A cost that included not only the physical scars of their torment, but also the emotional scars of the violence that followed.
The story of Dachau does not end with the liberation of the camp or the summary executions of the guards. It is a story that continues to haunt those who lived through it, a story of revenge, justice, and the deep moral dilemmas that war often forces upon its participants. But as the years pass, one question remains. Was true justice ever achieved that day, or was it just another chapter in a cycle of violence that continues to this very day?